A few videos ago, I turned a stock set of wheels into dual wheels and added them on this Jeep. But I bolted them directly to a stock axle. And the stock axle isn't really strong enough for dual wheel stuff. So in this video, we're going to work on axles. And step one is buying another Jeep. The main reason I bought this Jeep is right there. That's a full floating axle in the rear. And that's what you want for dual wheel stuff. Now, I didn't even look at the stuff in here. I just saw the amount of parts and I knew I could do something with it. One thing I was low on was drive shafts, and there's a front one there. And there's the rest of a front one here on a spare transfer case. The front axle has the steering arm mounted to the axle itself, which means that's from an MB or GPW. That's a military version. This one's a standard Jeep axle with a taper on the end. And then I was looking at this one. This does not have the separate hub. This is all a one-piece axle shaft. The brakes look a little bit bigger, but the pumpkin is still offset to the side. But I don't know what it's from. Then we got another front axle here. This would be a later version. It doesn't have the steering arm. And I see several brake drums. I'll have to pull all this stuff out and see what I really got. But I definitely have many things. This Jeep came with more spare parts than went in the truck. Got a fuel tank, seat frames, tailgate, a fender, grill, radiator, a hood, the other fender, and a CJ-2A I windshield. The interesting thing is, according to the data tag, this is a 2A. But that is definitely a 3A windshield, complete with a little flip-up vent and everything. I got plenty of Bondo with the deal. More than enough. I took a close look at this tailgate. There's no name stamped in it, so at first I assumed aftermarket. I flipped it over, and I saw braces on the backside. So then I started thinking M38. But then I flipped it back over. Those braces are for a fuel can mount and a spare tire mount, but there's no holes drilled in it. So now I don't know what it is, except slightly rusty. I've got this Jeep unloaded. While I was doing it, I noticed there's not a whole lot of bolts holding things in. There's no bolts holding the roll cage to the body, and there doesn't seem to be any bolts holding the body to the frame. Even all the wiring and stuff is disconnected. I'm going to try putting a little upward pressure on this body and see what happens. Transfer case shift lever got stuck. Easy fix. But now I needed to find somewhere to put the body. I got this frame as a freebie from a couple guys that were clearing out their yard. It's not actually a flat fender frame. Looks like it was from a CJ-5. It looks like it has the bigger brakes, and it looks like someone did a spring over axle conversion. So this is going to be a lot taller. But there is a bonus free fuel pump. The body lines up right over the frame pretty well on both sides here. This front mount isn't exactly right, but it's pretty close. Looks like that hole in the frame will line up this flange pretty well. We got a cross member that lines up with the body pretty nicely. This rear mount looks homemade, but I bet they made it to fit that CJ-5 body. The holes that mount are pretty close on this one. I can make this work. I tried mounting a fender, and the fender actually hits the frame, so I can't swing it into place. That looks like a pretty easy fix though. I put some pieces of scrap 1x1 tubing under the body, and this solved the fender fit problem. I'm trying to set the grill in place here. It runs into the battery box. Not sure if that battery box is factory. Looks a little bit torch made. And underneath it, there's a massive crack in the frame that needs to be rewelded. So we're just going to do a battery box delete for now. Let's try that again. There goes the camera light. Got bolts holding the fenders in and the grill on. Actually, it's fitting pretty well. The shock mount lines up decently. The angle lines up fairly well. It even looks like the factory frame mounted pedals will line up. There's a hole in the floor. We're right about there. That looks like it'll all work. You might wonder why I bothered using the CJ5 frame. Let me show you. Now this is a real CJ-2A all original. And see how the body and the frame end in the same spot? This CJ5 frame is considerably longer. And the reason it's longer is for these leaf springs. The leaf springs are a lot longer. Longer leaf springs work better, which is why they went to them later. And I think anything that I need a cage in, I'm going to need springs that work well. But this will be a project for a different day. With the body off, I could see that rear axle. Now, there were two different full floating axles that came in these early Jeeps. The MBs had a light duty one. I've heard it called a Dana 23-2 or a Dana 27. Never seen one in real life, so I don't know what this really is. And then the very early CJ-2As had a Dana 41 that was a full floater. I did not expect to see 44 cast into this. I don't know of any full floating 44s, which means that might be a custom axle. And that could cause me some problems. Because I needed axle shafts, and I bought some for a stock Jeep axle. These shafts are readily available, and actually the cheapest one. It doesn't feel like the spline's engaged. This could be a problem. We're going to have to do a little more exploration. One nice thing about these axles is a drain plug on the bottom. And once you dig out all the dirt that's always filling these plugs, then you can get a wrench in it and take it out. There we go. Usually I like playing what's in my engine. Now I have to play what's in my rear axle. And that's why it's not making it to the final cut. So, let's find out what's in my rear axle. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. These bolts are all loose. Wonder what's in here. There's a ratio tag, 43/8. So this might be a 538 rear end. Here we can see the 43 and the 8, 538 gears. Technically it's 5.375, but they call them 538s. And an open differential. Not rusty though. That's good. I see a tiny little bit of pitting on the ends of the gears, but they basically look okay. Spider gears all look okay. We're going to call this good. We just got to figure out what axles fit it. This is a socket I use for front axles. And it's pretty close. Someone took a chisel to the nut. That's why it doesn't fit. It is the right tool for operating a socket. I don't think I'm doing anything wrong. Bearing's a little crusty. I undid the backing plate bolts. The backing plate's loose. So is this spindle. That is a separate bolt-on piece. And apparently that was wasps inside there. Now I just have to figure out how many splines it has. Try shoving a light in here, see if we can see what's going on. Maybe we can get a decent spline count on this.
There's only 3 available splines for this axle, 10, 19, and 30. I can only see half of it, but I could tell it was more than 10 and not enough to be 30. It must be 19 spline.
This axle is a 10 spline axle, which is what it's supposed to have. That's a lot coarser spline. I'm not sure what to do yet, so I'm going to look at some more axles and work on something else, try to figure this one out. I made a bit of an axle collection here. Those are fronts, those are rears, and there's a Jeep that needs axles. Got to figure out what we have here. I don't have the military axles here because those might actually be something someone wants. These are all my junk axles that are lots of spare parts, which means I can play with them and make up a pair of good axles and put it under that Jeep. Now this one has the backing plate go over the drum. I'm pretty sure this is a later style like 50 CJ-3B. Right here, I see a 44. The drums are rubbing a little, but that's normal with sand. Everything seems to spin free. Let's take a look at these gears. They look nice. There, I don't know if you can see it, it says 43.8. That's a 538 gear ratio, which is normal for one of these early Jeeps. And this has 9-inch diameter drums. I'm going to make note of this so I don't forget later. Now I remember it. When I tilted it up, water started coming out. This one is probably less good. This one is a Dana 41, so that one's an earlier axle. Standard flat fender 9-inch drum brake with a fixed pivot on the bottom and top adjusters that are just an eccentric that holds the shoe away and extends the cylinder out to wherever it needs to be. This one has a tag that has 43.8 on it, another 538. Yeah. Rusty, muddy stuff. Apparently the ring gear on these are larger diameter, but the carrier isn't, so you have a lot of gap here. For as much water's in here, it doesn't look that bad. I don't feel any really big pitting. It's mostly surface. Spiders look okay. Another open differential. Clean up a little bit of the scoop. I really have seen much worse ones. As I was labeling this one, I noticed something. This area of the cover is pretty skinny. That's about 1.5 inches wide. On this Dana 44, that's a lot wider. That's about 2.5 inches. So that's an easy way to tell if the whole thing's covered in grease and oil. And by that logic, that one right there should be a Dana 44. Let's find out. I cleaned up the area where the casting number was in the last one. Nothing. I cleaned up the other side too. Nothing there. But there we have it on the top driver's side front. So it is a 44, but definitely a different casting than other 44 we had. And these are 10-inch brakes. I'm going to take a wild guess that this was taken out of a CJ5 and then buried underground for a while. Popping this cover off will be a little easier because this has the bolt delete feature. 4 of them are missing. I'm sure the missing bolts don't mean anything bad. Ooh, this is good. Well, good and bad. The good part, that's not an open differential. That right there is limited slip.
This carrier contains spider gears and clutches. Like all gears, these spider gears push apart with a vector force of the line of action, and that pushing force makes these clutches engage on either side. And that locks it up, kind of. Makes it slip less.
Bad part is the ring gear is rusty. But maybe it's not too rusty. Let's see. Does it turn? Doesn't want to turn easily. Try pulling this drum off. Maybe that'll make it turn better. Could be the drum is stuck. Brakes are definitely stuck on. Looking at the other side here, this is a more modern style with an adjuster on the bottom. Looks like pushing down on the screwdriver loosens it up. Hopefully both sides work the same. Wait, they're upside down. This one has the adjuster on the top and the wheel cylinder on the bottom. This one has the adjuster on the bottom and the wheel cylinder on the top. That doesn't seem right. Try adjusting it anyway. There we go. Drum is very rusty and full of dirt. Right now, does the whole thing turn? No. If that axle shaft turns, this axle shaft turns. There we go. Let's get some oil in this thing. That was used diesel oil I put in here. It which is definitely not what you want to use, but seeing how bad this is, I don't think it's going to make it any worse. And I'm certainly not going to waste good oil on trying to get this thing freed up. Right at the top here, I can see the gear ratio. It's a 47-11. So 47 teeth on the ring gear, 11 teeth on the pinion. Got it turning all the way over now. It's doing better. A little crunchy, but it's turning. I'm just going to soak everything in here. Oh, there's a chunk. That probably wasn't good. Well, there's chunks in there already. It can join its friends. I got it turning by hand fairly decently, so I'm going to try spinning it a little faster. Let's see how messy this gets. Well, it's definitely turning. Still crunchy. Even though this one is in the worst condition, this is the one I'm installing in the Jeep, because I want that limited slip. I decided I'm just going to completely ignore the bearing issue for now, because that Jeep doesn't have an engine in it. If it doesn't have an engine, well, you really don't need to worry about the bearings. I'll leave myself a note to remind me to put bearings in this, after I put an engine in that. The nut on the U-bolt seemed a little stuck. It didn't want to come off. I broke down and bought some new U-bolts. They had them at O'Reilly's. More than I wanted to spend, but apparently U-bolts have gotten more expensive these days. These wood clamps are pretty good for grabbing stuff, like those threads, that you don't want to damage. Only problem is, they have almost no power on this end. I'm going to use that end. Now I can use this to pull that U-bolt together, get it through the plate. I had the one spring plate that was on this axle, and that fit fine. I also found spring plates in the back of that other Jeep with all the parts. Since it was in a 2A, I thought they'd be 2A spring plates. They're not. They're about a ½ inch wider, which means I don't have spring plates to bolt that other side on. I already popped money on new U-bolts. That's enough. I'm not buying spring plates. These factory spring plates have issues anyway. The shock mount is just a piece of rod sticking out the side, and that's welded to the plate. And they break off. Here, you can see one that's bent. On this side, it's missing entirely. There's the welds where the shock mount used to be. Also, the U-bolt threads are the lowest thing sticking down. If you scrape on something, you hit those threads and mangle the U-bolts. When I was working on this red Jeep, I added a feature. I added a loop of metal. And this is fantastic for putting a hook in when you're tying this thing to a trailer. That looks thick enough. Had to scrounge up some extra material to make a few more of these, and some extra parts. One of the front U-bolts is bigger than the rest. I had to make one plate where this extra wide U-bolt will fit in. Got a few of these big step bolts lying around. I haven't had a use for them yet. They're a little bit bigger diameter than the stock shock mount, but bigger is stronger. We'll deal with installing the shock later. Bushing squish.
I cut the threaded end off to the length I needed. Then I cut the head off to give me a stub left over.
I added some lumps of weld to stick that shoulder bolt onto the plate. Then I used the other piece of bolt on the other side. And now, I'm going to put a cover plate on top. Got the top pieces welded on. And I added a couple of side plates to box the whole thing together. Sprayed on some black Rust-Oleum. Now I have spring plates that are stronger, have a bit of protection for the threads from the U-bolts, a stronger shock mount, and they make a good tie-down point. Good thing I didn't have stock ones, because I like these better. I've solved my rear axle problem in this Jeep, but I've done nothing to help me with the dual wheel problem. So let's go to the pile of front axles and see if this helps. Well, I noticed right off the bat, these brake drum hubs look an awful lot like that one that I just took off this rear axle. This first one came out of a CJ-2A that I bought sometime in the early 80s for 25 bucks. didn't find the axle number cast here, but I did find where it's clearly labeled front axle. Didn't find the axle number here either. I found it right there. This is definitely a Dana 25. The drums are seized solid. I think on both sides. Yeah, the pinion does turn, but it won't turn the drums. Let's see how bad it looks inside. Got to dig for some of these bolts. There's one right there, I think. Yep, there it is. Oh, I don't see rust. Doesn't look too bad in there. Little rust here and there, but not where the teeth normally contact. Pinion doesn't look rusty. That whole thing turns. It's like the rust is concentrated to the ends of the axles. So we're going to call this one good. Or at least good enough. We'll call this one okay. This one I already stole parts off of for the little red Jeep. It's clearly labeled the Dana 25. Let's take a look under the cover and see what we got. Oh, there's even oil in this one. This one looks like it's in pretty good shape. There we got the 43 1/8 stamp, so another 538 gear set. Really, the only problem I see is someone scraped up the gasket when they took off the cover. Other than whoever did that, this thing looks pretty good. Put an exclamation point after that good. Now this axle came out of a 1964 CJ-5.
This CJ-5.
It is a Dana 27. This also has the bigger 10-inch diameter brakes. As I turned it over, I noticed the drum is rusted through. And I already stole the hubs for the covered wagon project. But I've never pulled off the cover, so let's see what's in there. This tag's supposed to tell you info about the axle, but it's way too rusted to read. Ooh. That's a big clump of stuff. That looks like rust in there. Oh, it turns. That's good. Let me pull those hubs off. I think I just barely set the bolts in on these. Just enough to keep the parts together. Oh yeah, snap ring. It's in there somewhere. There we go. Let's see if we can turn it now. There's lots of debris in there. That's not usually a good sign. This whole side looks rusted up. Looks like there's rust in the case. There was definitely water in here. Looks usable, but not good. Found the stampings, 47 ring gear, 11 pinion. It's a 4:27 ratio. I also noticed that this does not have a drain plug on the bottom. So while I got it open, I'm going to flip it over and drain all that goop out and let it drip dry for a little while. Ooh, there's a clump. We'll let that ooze for a while. This is the one I want to see the most, for two reasons. The first reason is this steering arm. This axle has two attachment points for steering, and this extra arm is going to really help out. Because this Jeep has a late model recirculating ball style steering box. Looks like it's from the 60s or so. The mounting is a little crude, but it's very strong, so that's going to be totally fine, and much better steering than the stock system. These Jeeps came from the factory with a Ross style steering box.
This is the go-to style steering box in the 1920s. It used a worm gear on the steering shaft
that just drives two pins, and that rotates this arm, which has a joint on it, goes all the way up to this joint, which goes to this bell crank that has a pivot on it, which connects to this tie rod that goes to one wheel, and the other wheel connects to the passenger side tie rod with another joint. So you have 7 joints and pivots that all could have slop on them, driven off a box that wasn't particularly precise in the first place. 100 years or so ago, that system made sense. But there's better options now. There's one arm connection where I can hook the extra tie rod. And the other reason is this axle was found underneath the same mobile home that rear axle with the limited slip was found. They were dug out of the dirt as a match set. So I'm gonna pull this cover off and hope I have another limited slip. There's only 2 bolts holding the cover on, and they're finger tight. So someone else has been in here. What do we have? Yep. That's another limited slip. 4711, the same 427 gear ratio. That's the one I'm gonna use. Let's see how the bearings compare to the last limited slip. Oh, it turns by hand. Little pile of goop here. Not too bad, we'll ignore that. That looks like a bug of some kind. Little chunk of rust, ignoring that. More rust, more ignoring. I think this one is in good shape. We just have to deal with the minor missing stuff problem. But before I do that, I want to take a look at this spindle here. It's only held on by 1 bolt. Let's try to get this thing off of here. Got a little bit of crust holding it on. There we go. Probably gonna have to clean that spline someday. Let's take a walk over here. Well, those look similar. Exact same length. Huh. That is good information to know. I need to do some work on this axle, but I figured it'll be easier to deal with attached to a vehicle rather than loose on jack stands. So, I bought some springs on eBay a while ago because I knew I was going to need them. I also bought some eBay attaching hardware. Most of the stuff is pretty self-explanatory. This is something I wanted to show you. It looks like just a bolt with a nut on it and a hole drilled through it for a grease fitting. Underneath the head of the bolt, there's a spline. That actually drives into the spring mount and prevents this thing from turning. So if you ever need to take one of these apart, only undo the nut and drive the bolt out before trying to turn it. Also, these cheap ones are too long. They didn't come with any washer at all. The cotter pin hole was way off the castle nut, so I added a washer and it got a little closer, at least close enough to work. They definitely don't quite seem right. I'm just gonna go ahead and attach this front axle on and then deal with spindles and stuff. This is the side where you need that larger U-bolt, because you got the casting of the pumpkin, the bolt goes over that, not just the axle tube. Luckily, I got a plate for that. Now we're going to find out if this steering system from an unknown Jeep axle found under a mobile home is compatible with the steering box of unknown manufacturer that definitely was not original to this Jeep. Oh, we're pretty close, but the wheels are turned slightly. So I'll turn the Pontiac wheel. It's in the ballpark, but that angle is never going to work. Gonna have to free up that adjuster and turn this a little. Hey, this one's already loose. That's handy. That moved. There we go. The taper on this joint is too small, so I might be able to upgrade this to the next size up or make some kind of bushing to make this one smaller. We'll worry about that a little bit later. That'll be fine for now. A little loose, but that's okay, because we still don't have an engine. Speaking of engines, I noticed this hood has had a hole cut in it, probably for a carburetor of a V8 to stick out. Someone had definitely done some modifying in this Jeep at one point. But I don't need a hole in the hood on this one. On one that has better suspension and a roll cage, we might need a V8 in that one. I think I'm going to swap out the hoods. Even has a working latch on one side. Before I go any further, I want to clean these up. Because right there's a seal that's supposed to keep lubricant inside this axle. And with this thing full of dirt and rust, as soon as I try to steer it, it's going to scrape up that seal and make it worse than it already is. It probably is bad already, but I don't want to make it worse, because that would be more bad. We got to see if turning this wheel turns those wheels, which don't have wheels on them yet. I got to get to that at some point, but they will have wheels someday. Turning. I've owned this Jeep for quite a few years. That's the first time it's ever had steering. Though I just realized why the old hood was bent. There's a master cylinder mounted to the firewall that hits the hood. It's a Ford master cylinder with a plastic reservoir. Those plastic reservoirs are fairly modern, like 30 years or so. Let's see if that works. Seeing how there's just a boot and no push rod, I'm guessing it doesn't work. Apparently the socket wanted to go exploring. Add this to the pile of parts. Now the hood closes right. I'm going to pull off these spindles and clean them up a little bit. Looks like they've been laying in the dirt for a long time. Usually it feels okay though. These threads are all full of mud too. We're going to clean them up with a tap so we can actually put bolts in here. That's ready for something to bolt onto it. We're going to use the old sock on the stick trick. That's a good way to get a rag through a bore. Then you can clean out the inside. Get all that debris out of there. We're getting there. Now I need some brakes. I could steal those 10-inch drums from this old Dana 27, but they're the ones that have a rust hole in them. And it's going to be a real pain to take them off. I could steal some 9-inch drums. These turn, but they're a lot smaller and they won't break as well. So what I'm going to do is break out something I've been hoarding for a while. These are from a Suzuki Sidekick. I used pieces off this for my Suzuki dump truck build. Today I'm going after these brakes. This one has a solid mount with some pins that let the caliper float. Now these rotors have a little threaded hole here, which doesn't look like it has any use. It's there to remove it. So you take a bolt, then you power it in with excessive force, and it acts like a press. There. Now your rotor's free. A long time ago I bought these adapter plates, so long ago that the masking tape's all dried out.
Also, they used to be sold 1 axle at a time. Now they're sold 2 axles at a time.
I don't want this tape buildup to keep it from sitting flat, so I guess I'm going with a razor blade. These go on in place of a backing plate right there. You can index it to any of these 6 positions. But the guy who designed this plate was smart because he made this slightly offset. If this position is too high and this position is too low, you flip it over and you can have a middle position. So there's a whole nother round of clocking possibilities if you just flip them over. And since they're symmetric, either way works fine. I'm going to put the caliper back here. Get all that bolted together with grade 8 hardware and Loctite.
A lot of videos ago, I stole this drum and hub off my little red Jeep.
See this big gap here?
It was bent and had mismatched studs.
Notice how the gap changes?
Of course I had saved it, and now it comes in handy.
Do you see the drum flexing? That's why you don't do this without backing it up. That's probably how this drum got bent in the first place. I don't care about the drum, it's scrap, but I don't want to break and have anything come flying at me, so I'm going to put a backing behind this. An impact socket usually works fine. You put that over where the stud's going to come out, so it supports the area around the stud. Then they pop right out. Now we have a loose hub with nothing on it.
I reused the studs that were right-hand thread.
And I bought some new right-hand studs to replace the left-hand ones. They are Dorman part number 610034. Bearings are in place and locked down. Locking hub goes on. We got all the driving stuff together. Now we can add the stopping part. Rotor fits nice. There's some little spacers supplied with this bracket. He also supplied new bolts, but I had the old factory ones. Looks like everything lines up pretty nicely. And this Jeep now has vented disc brakes. The big question is what rim will fit on this. This is a stock 15-inch rim. That hits the caliper. This is a stock 16-inch like would have come on a flat fender. Well, that flare is a problem. There, that problem's resolved. That's just the brakes dragging you here. It turns free. So the 16-inch wheel will fit.
I did try a different set of 16-inch wheels back when this was just a frame, and there was some rubbing, but the fix was easy.
Now that fits. Found another problem I'm going to leave for future me. Apparently those rotors are thicker because those wheel studs I reused are far too short. Those Dorman ones I bought as a replacement, a little under $3 a piece, they're okay. I should have spent the extra $8 or so to get the other 3. Remember that one, future me, when you get around to putting an engine in this. Eventually those will need to be changed. For now they're fine. It's just sit in the yard anyway. I am happy with how that whole disc brake setup fits. That's nice. My rotors might be a little warped, but they're okay for now. At least it's all off-the-shelf parts if I need to replace anything. When I installed the dually tires, I mentioned the lug situation here. We've got 2 left hand, 2 right hand, and 1 lug nut delete. We're going to fix all that in one shot here. We're going to remove that entire drum. Oh, missed with a hammer, popped the thing off. I'll have to remember that technique. I'm really upsetting the spiders that live here, but this backing plate has to come off. You can run away. That's a good reason to run away. This might be pressed in. I'm going to try gently tapping. Yeah, it's not moving. We're going to have to come up with a way to pull this out. Found an old crank pulley in my parts pile and a wheel bearing lying on my workbench. I am going to have to pull one of these races out. There we go. That too. Now this fits over the bearing and hits the flange. This bearing fits right in that groove. Just need a little more spacing here. Tried adding a wheel spacer, which fit, but I don't have enough thread sticking out to make this work. Found a 1/2 inch thick ring I was making for a different project. That fits right over the bearing. That old ATV wheel bearing's actually acting as a thrust bearing. Now we're getting somewhere. Oh, just felt it move. The bearing started hitting the taper, so I had to take it apart to add another spacer. You can see how far that bearing's come out. I bet this one will fit now. There it goes. And that is a 10 spline, like my new axle shafts. My new axle shafts fit, with just about 1 front spindle of distance to go. I noticed the difference between a stock front spindle and the ones I pulled off this rear axle. The stock one has a pilot about 3 3/8 diameter. This one's turned down to below 3 inches. That opening is below 3 inches. So this diameter has to be turned down slightly to fit in that axle housing, which is easy to do, but I already have these. So I'm just going to install these. They fit perfect. I've had these brake parts sitting on my shelf for years. You may have seen them before. What I have here are brake parts. If you recall, it had no brakes at all. I've got everything from the wheel cylinders, the hard lines, the rubber lines, the master cylinder, and the shoes all in this pile. Brand new stuff, ready to go. So today we are going to install a snowplow.
That was last decade, so it's finally about time to install those parts.
I'm redoing a spare backing plate. Just want to point out, there's the upper adjuster that I mentioned before. I'd forgotten, there's a lower adjuster too. These are fixed in operation. There's an eccentric cam in here, so they can move for adjustment, and you lock them down once you get them right. So the only thing that floats inside this drum in operation is that wheel cylinder. When the wheel spins this way, you hit the brakes, the wheel cylinder, both pistons slide that way, and that side gets the bigger shoe. There's the rear backing plate I pulled off this Jeep. That's the spare front one I just put together. They're basically the same thing. Rears have a 3/4 inch bore cylinder. Fronts have a 1 inch bore cylinder, but I put a 3/4 on this one. So now this will work fine in the rear. Modified front spindle, backing plate. Pop the drum on here. The old outer bearing was pretty bad, so I swiped one out of the other axles. Then I ground away the chisel marks. So now my socket actually fits and I can tighten this thing down. We have a full floating hub. The question is, does my new axle fit? No. We've got a gap. And that thing's bottomed out. It's almost exactly a 1/2 inch we need to gain here. I have the old and new axles lined up with a 1/2 inch difference on the end here. On the old axle, you can see where the spider gears run. Looks like we got enough spline to do that. That material is not as hard as I expected it to be. We got a full floating axle. Good timing too, because my camera light's broken and I'm about to run out of daylight. I've found enough bolts in my bin to bolt the axle shaft in. Now this is able to handle a lot more weight. Though some of you may have noticed I keep talking about weight, there might be other concerns besides the axle on the weight. Like this frame that's missing the entire bottom of the C channel and is ripped all the way up more than halfway. But I think that's really just a matter of camera angle. Let's go back a bit. If you look at it from this angle, with this completely rust-free CJ-2A frame blocking the view of the rust holes in that CJ-2A frame, it looks a lot better.
The second side went smoothly because I already had all the tools out from the first side.
I already know how this works. One spacer there, pulley, bearing, washer and nut, power tool. So far, every single nut I've run into has chisel marks. Mostly fixed. Now, see if this axle fits. Huh. That one fits perfect. Weird. It concerns me a little bit that this fit in and the other one I had to cut. So we're going to see how much engagement we have. I'm going to pull out and try to turn it. That's a lot of spline. There we go. That's the distance of spline engagement. That's fine. A couple of these didn't want to thread in nicely, so we're just going to clean it up a bit. All the threads are full of goop. Now my tap's full of goop. We've got a complete full floating axle.
Time for some testing and see how that axle holds up. Seems to be working fine.
That's it for this video. When I put dually tires in the Jeep, I knew the axle wasn't strong enough, but now it's a full floater, and it should be a lot stronger. Wasn't exactly the way I was planning on doing it, but we got there eventually. Along the way, we took this Jeep and added 2 axles, both with a limited slip, and got the steering working with that modern recirculating ball box it had. And as an extra bonus, vented front disc brakes. So this one's got the start of becoming a good all-around driver. We threw together that one, which I don't actually have a use for yet, but it's got the longer springs of the CJ-5, it's got a roll cage, and it's got the cool looking flat fender body. And the whole time I was working on it, I kept thinking it needs a V8. It's got a cage already. That could be interesting. I started with the goal of getting that with a full floater. Then I got distracted along the way with a few other little side projects here, but I was having fun. And eventually, I actually got the goal done. So I'm going to call that a win with a bonus. I hope you guys are having fun too, and we'll see you next time. If you're still here, you may have watched more than one of my videos. I got a question for you guys. While I was doing this, I realized I could separate this into 3 separate videos at least. They'd be shorter, but I could upload them more frequently. But I decided it would be good to show you how all 3 projects interrelated together and how parts move from here and there to get everything done. But I'd like your opinion. Would you like more frequent, shorter videos with smaller subjects? Or are you willing to wait a little longer for a video that covers a little more stuff in depth? Let me know in the comments. I appreciate your feedback.